The topic of our workshop is the pain of others and your own, facing trauma in ministry and in media. This is a research topic that I've been working on over the last 5 years. It began during a sabbatical that I took at Biola University, and God really brought this topic into my awareness in ways that have been just profound for me as a person. So I'll be sharing about that a little bit as I move forward. So let me begin with a little introduction to myself, and I'll do it by showing you my own background. So why does trauma matter for us? What I'll tell you is it matters for me in that my own background involves trauma. The pictures you see on the screen are my grandparents. The person on the left is Guadalupe Paez Tapia. She is my grandmother, my mother's mother. And this picture of you, a picture of her that you see on the screen was taken in about 1935. We're not sure exactly the date, but we do know that she came from a difficult background. She came from Mexico to Chicago in central part of the United States in the 1920s with the man who brought her to the US, whom she married, my grandfather. But the relationship was dysfunctional, and there was a lot of discord and difficulty in their marriage. My grandfather drank alcohol a lot, and we don't know if that contributed to the problems in their home or not. But we do know that my grandmother died of a gunshot wound when my mother was 3 years old. To this day, we don't know if it was self-inflicted or if my grandfather shot his wife or if someone in their apartment did the shooting, but we know that she died tragically from gun violence. On the right, you see the picture of my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather is the man in the back with the hat. And the girl off to the left is his wife. At the time this picture was taken, she was probably in her late teens, and he was in his mid-20s. And when this picture was taken, they were under Stalinist control of what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. When the Nazis attacked the USSR during World War II, they occupied my grandparents' village. And so my grandparents, during the war, ended up fleeing from the USSR to Germany by means of Nazi occupation. And they were held in labor camps in Germany and dealt with some horrific experiences that have affected my father to this day and his sister. My grandparents are with the Lord. They came to Christ on the boat coming over from the US to Chicago. But this was a picture that shows the trauma. You can see the trauma in their faces and how life was hard for them. So I am a product of trauma in my own life. And so what God has really shown me through my research and through just my experiences is that I need to be sensitive to the trauma of my students. And I also need to understand my teaching of journalism and media through the lens of trauma and being aware of its effects on people. So what sets Christian media apart? There's a difference. There is a difference between the reporting that's done by mainstream media, the BBC, Agence France-Presse, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, New York Times. What sets them apart from the reporting done by Christians. And I would suggest that it's that Christians seek to know as we are known. And I get that phrase from Parker Palmer in his book, To Know as We Are Known, Education as Spiritual Journey. In that book, he says, truth requires the knower to become interdependent with the known. Both parties have their own integrity and otherness, and one party cannot be collapsed into the other. The knower and the known are implicated in each other's lives. So there's a sense in which journalists who are Christians, whether they're working for a mainstream international news agency, or they're working for Christianity Today, or a Christian publication, Christian organization, we must know as we are known. Transparency, vulnerability to the other is crucial, and humility is so important to this. This picture you see at the lower left is a homeless man living in what's called the Inland Empire outside of Los Angeles. It's a desert community filled with people who are either very rich or very poor. And this is a man who lives on the street, has no home, lives from day to day, not knowing where his next meal will come from. And so for me as a Christian telling his story, I have to understand that he has a human soul, not just a person to be photographed or to include as data and statistics in my story. So trauma happens. It happens to all of us. It happens all around us. Research tells us that it is defined in these ways. Trauma is any threat to our life, to our bodily integrity, or to our sanity. Sometimes trauma is an event. Sometimes it's a lived experience over time or in a moment. It can be a reaction to others' experience. One of you asked the question, what about vicarious trauma? How do we deal with that? We'll actually be talking about that in a minute in my presentation here. But we can be traumatized by others' trauma. Children seeing trauma that happens to their parents. Friends seeing someone they care about being traumatized. And I'll add that how we respond to trauma, how trauma affects us, is different for each person. It affects everyone. I will say that. Research I saw that I continue to look at shows that everyone is affected by trauma. So people who say it doesn't affect me are not being honest. So some types of trauma that have been clinically examined that I looked at include these: child abuse or neglect, gun or weapons violence, which has affected my family, rape or sexual assault, natural disasters, hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, crashes, auto crashes, trains, plane crashes, medical emergencies like COVID-19 that we are all experiencing right now in our countries, and then of course military combat. So this picture you see on the screen, it breaks my heart, but it's a man who came upon this crash scene. He's not a doctor, he's not an EMT, he's just a guy with a phone. And he saw this woman pinned inside this car, and he walked over and he's calling medical help for her, and he's saying to her, I can't help you, but I am here, and I will be with you. I will not leave you until help arrives. And so to me, this is, it's a heartbreaking image, but it shows what God calls us to do. And that is, even if we feel unprepared, even if we feel that we ourselves, even if we have been dealing with trauma, we don't know what to do. I believe God calls us to come and be with people and be praying for them and asking God to provide. And as happened here, thankfully, this woman was freed from this vehicle without serious injury. But you can imagine the horrific memories that she'll have from this experience. So the effects of trauma have been downplayed. This is unfortunate, but it's true for journalists. It's true for people in ministry and the research that I've done. Trauma overwhelms us. At its worst, it can make us feel like we can't go on. We can't continue living. Trauma's effects are emotional, but they are also physiological. They affect our bodies, not just our minds. Trauma causes depression. It causes anger. It causes anxiety, sleeplessness, panic attacks. It makes us exhausted, and it can give us a sense of helplessness, a sense of helplessness in our lives. I mentioned this, it's an adage you may have heard, time heals all wounds. That is not true of trauma. It's not true of trauma. Direct confrontation of and coping with trauma and the damage caused by it is crucial to sustained healing. And denial of the effects of trauma only compounds the problem. And unfortunately, many journalists, many first responders, many combat veterans, ministers who deal with trauma deny its effects, but those effects eventually catch up with them. Sadly, journalists, first responders, people in ministry in combat zones, in places of trauma, often do so with almost no help, little to no help. Because of lack of funding, because of lack of awareness. There's many reasons for this, but there's a culture, unfortunately, within media and even within the church, within ministry, that says, just keep going. Just keep going. And it's this culture of stoicism, denial, and sadly, even self-medication through various means that are just unfortunate. So, the good thing is the study of trauma in journalism, and I've seen this also in ministry, is growing. And that study is based on behavioral psychology, it's based in brain science, it's based in sociology, and it's also based in media ethics. So the unspoken truth of news is that trauma affects journalists just as much as it affects victims. So when we see journalists in combat zones reporting from Fallujah or from Baghdad, from places where there's combat, they act as if everything's fine, they're doing their job. In fact, they are being traumatized and need to find ways to cope with it, or they are in danger in their lives. Callous approaches to trauma only expand cynicism in audiences, and it's why many are turning away from journalism as a means of getting facts, and they're turning to fake news and to non-factual media. Disdain for news gathering has reached new lows, sadly, in the last few decades. There was a time, in my memory, when reporters had more respect, and they were treated with more of a sense of importance in our world. That's changed. That's changed in the last decade or two. It's unfortunate, and I think part of it comes from journalists' lack of concern for the trauma that their reporting brings to audiences. So compassionate approaches to trauma victims and family and friends, I believe, and I will suggest to you, leads to better stories, better reporting, better journalism, and leads to longer lasting connections for future stories. It makes journalism sustainable when we have compassion for those dealing with trauma. So, an easy thing to remember for you is that trauma is concussion. Trauma is concussion. Just like blunt trauma to the head causes long-term damage to the brain, whether it's from international football, soccer, from American football, from boxing, any trauma to the head. We have seen in recent decade, in the last 10 years, there's been significant research showing that it causes long-term damage to the brain and to the body. Repeated emotional and psychological trauma affects our minds. It affects our souls. It affects our bodies. It affects our ability to live. So my research, as I said, began in 2015. It was from a workshop that I went to at the University of Missouri at Columbia on how trauma affects journalists, how it affects first responders and audiences, and it's revolutionized my approach to how I teach and how I understand media and journalism. So let me mention this term that you may have heard of. It's called triggering. Triggering. What that is re-entry to feelings of anxiety upon seeing, hearing, smelling, even tasting something that brings back a vivid memory of a traumatic moment. I tell my students that when you have been traumatized, there are things that will take you back to that moment of trauma without your even being aware. Something will suddenly trigger you and take you back to that difficult time. Being aware of that triggering is so important for us, but I just wanted to mention that, and I'll come back to it in a minute. So I have some steps here for you to approach trauma for yourself and for those around you. The first one is to know that it's not all good. I think we as Christians have a tendency to smile and say, how are you? I'm fine. Everything's good. God is good. Yes, God is good. But no, we're not fine. Everyone we meet has something in their life that is not all fine. It's not all good. And many people around us are walking wounded. They have had suffering in their lives, and they're waiting for somebody who will care enough to listen and to understand them. So it's touched many more than we realize. There's a culture of denial that I've mentioned earlier. To begin a conversation with someone about trauma can be very awkward because we all have our barriers up. We are afraid to be hurt by people. But I would say don't let that be a barrier. Don't let that be a barrier. Begin the conversation. Begin listening. Majority culture people have a tendency to be blind to the pain of ethnic and racial minorities, those at the margins of our culture. Men, I'll just say this, can be blind to the suffering of women. In many cultures, including the United States, and I think I've seen this in evangelical church in the U.S., there's a sense of favoritism for men that leaves women and their value and especially their suffering to the side, and it's ignored, and that's very unfortunate. I will say this also, that the conversation or lack of it about the LGBTQ community is one that is laden with trauma as well. And I think we in the church have been slow to talk about this, but it is part of this suffering around us that I think we need to deal with. And then journalists have caused as much trauma as the events themselves, and they should own that, and they should be aware of how what they do could trigger and re-traumatize sources and audiences that they are working with. Step 2, rethink your own trauma story approach. So if you have background in trauma, understand that experience is not the same as the experience of those you're dealing with. So having humility and saying, help me understand your life. If you lack insight, research, finding out some background so that you don't come in completely blind. The example I got was a journalist in Chicago who was Caucasian, majority culture, and his research and reporting was on Black deaths among the Black community on the south side of Chicago due to gun violence. And he actually won a Pulitzer Prize. It's one of the highest prizes internationally for reporting. He won that prize for his reporting on gun violence in the Black community, even though he's Caucasian. I asked him, how did you do that? He said, by research, talking to people who know people, and just reading to learn what to do, what not to do, and how to be sensitive to the trauma in that community. So also think through coverage. It's already been done. How can you fill in the gaps and not repeat and be redundant? It's an important thing. Think about who you're going to be talking to. Why do you want to talk to them? That's their first question to you. Why me? Why do you want to talk to me? Do you care about me? And to ask questions sensitively, and maybe keep your questions brief, so you listen more than you speak. Asking only essential questions. Watching your lead, the first sentence of any article you write is the very most important. And so understanding how do you do that well in ways that doesn't add to the trauma that's already been done. And then, of course, be careful about photos and video and audio. I think journalists have a tendency to overdo it on how much gore, blood, disfigurement. How much do you have to show of that? I think we can err on the side of prudence and not showing as much, I think, as we have. You can tell it without screaming it, I'd suggest. So the third, take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Journalists, ministers, missionaries, we have a tendency not to take care of ourselves. So realize trauma affects you. Trauma affects you. Listen to your body, listen to your mind, listen to your soul. Someone asked about vicarious trauma and anxiety. That happens when we care for or about victims of trauma. Their trauma traumatizes us. It doesn't mean you stay away. There are ways to care for yourself so that you can continue with the work God's called you to do, but understand it has an effect and you have to sometimes step away and get rest. Compassion fatigue. Let me just mention this term. It was something my students resonated with. This is where you see so much trauma that you become numb to it. And I think that's a danger sign. When you see that happening, it's time to step back and get rest. And I will say, so I'll get to that in a minute. Next, very important to know this, the effects of trauma are often delayed. So people who say, oh, I'm fine, I'm not affected by this, wait a couple of weeks. Wait a few months. It could take years, but the effects of that trauma will, unless you deal with it, come back and they will affect you and cause things in your life that you never would have expected. So you have to prepare for that. It's just something we have to know and be prepared for. Next thing, this is so important. I come from a family of workaholics. Rest is not laziness. Please understand that. It's also not optional. God has designed us for Sabbath. And I'm not saying that you're not supposed to work on Sunday. What I'm saying is Sabbath is rest. It's walking in rest, looking for times when we just step away. Henry Nouwen, who I would encourage you to read about this, reminds us that Jesus himself was well aware of the suffering around him, but he took time to get away and be alone with God in silence, in solitude, and in prayer, recovering from the constant pressure on him when he was on earth. Asking for help is not weakness. We can't do this alone. You can't do this alone, especially if your job or your ministry involves trauma. We are made for community. Ecclesiastes 4:12 says, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And so we need each other. And so you need to not be alone in what you're doing. Seek out help from others. And then prayer is it's our lifeline. It's so crucial. Seeking God, even if you have no words, getting alone with God. He sees your tears. He hears your cries. He will help you pray when you have no words. Romans 8:26 and 27 says, the Spirit himself helps us in our weakness, sometimes with groans that aren't even articulating words. It's our soul crying out to God. And then remember that we can live in resilience, but it's a journey. You're never there. We will be healed of our trauma when we reach glory. Until then, we take it day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year. So some resources for you. The DART Center at Columbia University in New York is a website I would encourage you to look at. It has international connections. Emergencyjournalism.net. Emergencyjournalism.net is a resource for international journalists who deal with trauma. And then finally, the Poynter Institute for Media Studies in St. Petersburg, Florida, has resources for journalists based in the US, but there's application, I think, also for those of us in other countries around the world.